Welcome to another episode of Behind the Roasts. This month, I specifically want to focus on some roasting defects, common roasting defects, how to prevent those, and also give you important tips for the installation and calibration of your roasting machine to prevent defects down the line, to prevent situations that can take you away from like the perfect roast. So in my career roasting coffee, I would be the first one to admit that I've made roasting mistakes and I have caused roasting defects. So I would say there are two categories of roasting defects. One type of category is the one that you can measure, that you can see, that there's no dispute about it. And then there's the category of the more, we can call it subjective, they're flavor-related roasting defects and they can be interpreted as such. Now, first and for all, there are two roasting defects that are quite common and that one can see quite often, and those are tipping and scorching. So tipping, where does it specifically, what does it look like and how is it caused? And I'm going to, while I'm talking, I'm going to show some photos, some examples of how this looks like. So tipping obviously occurs at the tip of the bean. On one side of the bean where the embryo is or was, because once you start roasting coffee, the embryo is dead. On that side, as well as on the other side of the bean, on the other tip, there could be these burnt marks. So how are these tipping defects caused? One could be that the roasting machine that you're using, the drum, is simply too hot for what the bean can hold. That means that you're preheating your drum, preheating your roaster to a level of, to a temperature that is just too high for what the coffee can hold. And it literally has the effect that the beans, the tips of the beans, when they touch the interior of the drum, either the drum walls or the spokes, the vanes that keep the drum together, they start burning. And if this happens in a systemic way, then it can create an off flavor, an inconsistency in flavor. So the best remedy for tipping is to be careful, to take care of your start temperature, your charge temperature upon the start of the roast. Now, tipping and scorching, they can have two aspects in common, and that's specifically in the prevention of these defects. So scorching can happen on the back side of the bean, the side of the bean that is more curved, or it can happen on the flat side of the bean. If that type of scorching happens on the flat sides of the bean, I've also heard the term facing. Now, scorching also is an indication of the fact that your roaster is just too hot for what the coffee can hold, for what the coffee can withstand. And that obviously finds its explanation partially in the cellular structure of the bean and the makeup of the bean, but the best remedy, similar to with tipping, is to really be careful with your start temperature. And that obviously requires you to be more careful when you do your preheating of your roast or when you maintain the temperature of your machine in between roasts. Now, both defects can also be related to the aspect of calibration, specifically of your burners. So if you're using a machine that has a drum that is single walled, or if you're using a machine of which the materials of the drum could be more conducive to creating tipping or scorching. For example, stainless steel unfortunately tends to have that ability. then you need to be aware of the fact that when you're going to preheat your machine, that you need to do this very gently. And tipping and scorching, again, should be prevented, partially by doing a proper inspection of the coffee, because if you're dealing with a very soft bean coffee, then it might lend you to know that you need to be very careful with your temperature. Now, how do you know if your coffee is a soft bean coffee? Correct, you measure the density. Now, if you measure density and you're noticing a density that is less than 65 kilos per hectoliter, that's a unit that is used often on analyzers that measure density, then you must be taking extra care. You can also do an inspection, a visual inspection of your beans. And if your coffee beans are grown in a medium-high elevation or in a lower elevation, then just by doing a visual inspection can help you understand that you must take extra care in the beginning of your roast. Next, let's look at another interesting example of scorching, and that is internal scorching. So what is internal scorching? I haven't seen it discussed too much lately, but I think it's important to make mention of this. And this requires a little bit of understanding of what happens with your coffee beans before it arrives at your roastery. Obviously, when coffee beans are going through their processing, whether it's washed or natural or any type of anaerobic, then there's a drying phase. And during that drying phase, most producers use some sort of mechanical dryer. And if they don't use mechanical dryers, then they use for sure African beds, drying tables, in combination with some other form of drying system. And if the drying doesn't happen in an optimal way, then what happens then? The moisture content in the cellular structure is very possibly not distributed evenly. And the average green coffee bean has up to 1 million individual cells, so many tiny pockets dispersed all over the structure of the bean. And if you're talking about internal scorching, then what happens is that in certain areas of the bean where there is less moisture, relatively speaking, than in other areas of the bean, that moisture dissipates more quickly and can lead to pockets inside the bean overdeveloping, scorching, over roasting. And that again is related to charging your coffee too hot, being too ambitious. Now I know many of you, you're trying to do the optimum thing in roasting, and that obviously is related to the aspect that you're trying to hit the peak of your rate of rise and then come gently down during your roast. Now, if you hit that peak too high, so if your rate of rise is too high in the first phase of the roast, then you might run the risk that you're getting this internal scorching. Now, one of the best ways to inspect it is cutting some beans open and looking at the internal color and seeing if the internal color is uneven, and obviously also doing a flavor profiling of your coffee. Now next I want to talk about the two aspects related to what people consider roasting defects. That's baking and over roasting. Now, why are these examples somewhat subjective? Is that they're obviously, to a major degree, they're driven by what you determine from a sensory level. So baking, just to define what is baking and roasting, baking is where during the roasting profile, specifically getting closer to the first crack, that the internal bean development to some degree starts stalling, or if the rate of rise, so the increase in temperature of the bean, starts to lose its slope. And so when the rate of rise starts flattening out, then a lot of roasters, roasting experts, they talk about the aspect, that is baking and that is bad. But At the same time, baking, I've also noticed, is often used as an excuse for the bean just lacking flavor. There could be other factors leading to that note or that note that is lacking in the bean. So the best way to prevent baking in an absolute way is to ensure that you're not stalling in your bean temperature, especially getting closer to the first crack. As you know, when you're approaching the first crack and when you're running into the first crack, your bean temperature has the tendency to go down. Flavor. There could be other factors leading to that note or that note that is lacking in the bean. So the best way to prevent baking in an absolute way is to ensure that you're not stalling in your bean temperature, especially getting closer to the first crack. As you know, when you're approaching the first crack and when you're running into the first crack, your bean temperature has the tendency to go down fairly quickly. And you can prevent this by allowing enough heat to be locked into the bean and not decreasing the level of your burners too much, because that could lead to temperature loss and that could lead to the roast stalling. Also, there's aspect of over-roasted. So what is over-roasted? Over-roasted is basically a style of roasting where you're taking the bean development too far for what the bean should be worth. Certain coffees, in my experience, don't like to be roasted beyond a certain level. Now, that sounds very vague and subjective, but you can do this, you can put this to the test using a sample roaster if you have this, or just making sure that you're always checking the bean development of your coffee post-roast from a sensory level, and also doing a color assessment of that bean development. And over roasting, what does it come usually with? Is bitter notes, notes that lead in your cupping that lead to a drying sensation. If you're not finding florals that you're used to find in your coffee, if you're not finding the fruit tones that you're used to finding in your coffee, then that might be caused by the fact that that coffee was over roasted. Now, again, it is a term that should be treated carefully, because you might be in a market where there is a clientele that enjoys darker roast. And so who are you to determine that that coffee is over roasted? So that's a somewhat of a subjective, slippery slope where you have to make good judgments as a roaster operator. Then there is this other aspect of like a subjective roasting defect that's underdeveloped. So usually when we taste coffees and they have like an acidity that is just not pronounced, or they might have almost a metallic flavor note, folks often come to the conclusion, this coffee is underdeveloped. It just didn't have the right development for what it needed. And again, that can be very subjective, related to making conclusions on the roast, because maybe the coffee did not have any distinct acidity altogether. So first, you must always create a benchmark using your sample roaster and your cupping before you make these judgments. The underdeveloped usually means that the coffee did not get enough heat, and as a result did not get enough development coming into the first crack before you take the coffee out of your roasting machine. So underdeveloped could be very well prevented by allowing a little bit more time during the roasting in order to stay away from these flavors that are not pronounced, not indicative enough of the quality of the coffee you're roasting. And then last but not least, a defect related to roasting is, of course, Quaker. Now, Quakers are beans that during the growing cycle just did not develop the sugars needed to be able to develop this pigmentation during roasting. And the bean, as a result of this lack of sugars, during the growing and cultivation stage just simply led to the bean lacking flavor. It's like a bean that has no soul. It usually has a whitish, lighter, distinct lighter color. And the remarkable thing is that we can find this with some, specifically in the category of natural processed coffees, we find often more Quakers, and also in some exotic coffees like geishas. They're very prone to develop Quakers. Next, I would like to cover some conditions related to the installation and the calibration of your machine that can lead to roasting defects. So stay tuned and we will cover these aspects as well. This next aspect related to preventing roasting defects cannot be emphasized enough, and that's of course the cleaning of your machine. Clean your machine, please. Like here, we see a roasting machine. We've done just a couple of roasts, and this chaff, this wonderful chaff, which has some good applications for as a fertilizer, for example, needs to be cleaned. You need to be thorough with this. Chaff will collect here in your chaff collector. It will collect under in the inside of your cooling screen. It will also collect here with the Giesen. I'm going to walk to the other side. With the Giesen, we have this special drawer that collects particulate matter that could otherwise fall into the burner chamber, and it's collected here in this drawer. You need to vacuum out this drawer. If your roasting machine doesn't have this drawer, then you need to do a thorough inspection of the chamber where your burners are located. Because if debris is piling up there, then that can be sucked into your drum, or the smoke of that debris can create a smoky flavor to your coffee. Important aspect of prevention. One aspect that can cause ongoing roasting defects is the installation of your gas supply line. And I'm going to point to this W6 that we have here in Boot Coffee Campus. Here you see an example of a gas supply line that has a gas pressure indicator. So here we can actually see the actual gas pressure that we're feeding to the machine. And there is behind it is a valve with which we can regulate the pressure that we're giving to the machine. So what does this prevent? This prevents the possibility that your machine simply doesn't get enough power from a heat perspective, not enough gas power in order to do its job efficiently. I've seen this often where roasters say, hey, we're just not getting the right bean development. Our roasts are too slow. And as a result of that, the coffee just misses that oomph, that extra element. And that can often be related to this aspect right here.